Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Lily.
And I'm Bruce, and today we are doing something a little different.
A lot different, actually, because today we're going to talk about a technique that I genuinely believe can change the way you learn English. Not just help a little, change it.
That's a big claim.
It's a big claim because it's true. Here's the thing. Most English learners are trapped in what I call the comprehension gap. You understand everything. You watch English movies, you read English articles, you listen to English podcasts, and you get it. Your brain nods along, it recognizes the words, it follows the story.
But then someone asks you a question in English.
And suddenly, nothing comes out. Your mind goes blank. You know the words. You know the grammar, but your mouth just freezes.
I think almost every single person watching this video has felt that exact moment. That gap between I understand and I can speak.
Exactly. And here's why that happens. Most learners study forward. They read a sentence from the beginning to the end. They listen to a story from the beginning to the end. They repeat a phrase exactly as it was given to them, from start to finish. That feels natural, right? That's how we were taught in school.
It feels natural, but it's actually the problem.
It's the problem, Bruce, because fluency doesn't happen when your brain is comfortable. Fluency happens when your brain is forced to work. And today, we're going to introduce you to a method that flips the entire process upside down. Literally, we call it the reverse storytelling technique.
And I have to say, when Lily first told me about this, I was skeptical. I thought, reverse storytelling? That sounds like a gimmick. But after trying it myself for a few weeks, I completely changed my mind.
Stick around because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why working backward, starting from the climax of a story and rebuilding it all the way back to the beginning, creates a kind of mental pressure that cements phrasal verbs, idioms, and complex grammar into your memory almost instantly.
We're also going to break down, step by step, how to actually do this technique yourself, starting today with zero special tools.
We'll show you exactly how this forces your brain to stop translating word by word and start actually synthesizing English logic, thinking in cause and effect, the way native speakers naturally do.
And near the end, we've got a full 30-day framework you can follow. So this isn't just a nice idea you forget tomorrow. It's a system.
So here's what we're covering today. First, we'll talk about why traditional listen and repeat methods create a bottleneck, why you can understand everything and still say nothing. Then we'll break down the actual mechanics of reverse storytelling, step by step. After that, we'll go deeper into the linguistic logic this method triggers, things like past perfect tense and conditional moods that most learners avoid because they're scared of them.
Then we'll talk about rhythm, how this method naturally teaches you to stress the right words and sound less robotic, more like a real native speaker.
And finally, that 30-day framework, plus a challenge for you to try before this video even ends.
So if you're the kind of person who has said, I understand English so well, but I just can't speak it, this video was made for you.
Let's get into it.
Okay, Lily, let's start from the beginning. What exactly is this fluency paradox you keep mentioning?
So the fluency paradox is this strange situation where the more passively you study a language, the further away real fluency gets. It sounds backward, right? You'd think more study equals more fluency, but that's not how the brain works with language production.
Give us an example. What does passive study actually look like for most people?
Okay, picture this. A learner, let's call her Maria, watches English YouTube videos every single day. She listens to English podcasts on her commute. She reads English news articles. She's been doing this for 2 years.
Sounds like a dedicated learner.
Extremely dedicated. And if you gave her a listening test, she'd score incredibly high. If you gave her a reading comprehension test, same thing, high score. But if you sat her down and said, "Maria, tell me about your weekend," she would hesitate. She'd say simple sentences. "I go to park. I eat lunch with friend." Even though she understands sentences that are far more complex than that when she reads or listens.
So there's this huge imbalance between what she can understand and what she can actually produce.
That's the gap. And here's the key insight. Comprehension and production are not the same skill. They use overlapping but different pathways in the brain. When you listen or read, your brain is doing pattern recognition, matching sounds or symbols to meanings you already have stored. That's relatively passive. But when you speak, your brain has to do something much harder. It has to retrieve words from memory, arrange them in the correct order, apply the correct grammar in real time, and produce the sounds, all in a split second, under social pressure with someone waiting for your answer.
That's a lot happening at once.
It's an enormous amount. And listen and repeat methods, where you hear a sentence and just say it back, they only train a tiny slice of that process. You're not actually retrieving anything from your own memory. You're just echoing what you just heard. It's like the difference between reading sheet music while playing piano versus playing a song entirely from memory. Repetition is reading the sheet music. Speaking fluently is playing from memory.
I love that comparison, actually, because I remember when I was learning Spanish years ago, I could repeat phrases perfectly right after hearing them. But 2 minutes later, if someone asked me to use that same phrase in a new sentence, I couldn't do it.
Exactly. And that's not a failure on your part, Bruce. That's a failure of the method. Repetition creates short-term echo, not long-term retrieval ability. And this is where we introduce the missing ingredient, cognitive friction.
Cognitive friction. Okay, tell everyone what that means, because I know when you first explained it to me, it took me a minute to really get it.
So think of your brain like a muscle. I know that's a common comparison, but stick with me. If you lift a weight that's too light, your muscle doesn't grow. There's no resistance, no friction, nothing forcing adaptation. But if you lift a weight that's just heavy enough to challenge you, your muscle is forced to adapt and grow stronger.
So cognitive friction is the mental version of resistance training.
Precisely. Cognitive friction is the mental effort your brain experiences when it's forced to actively construct something rather than passively receive it. And here's the important part. This friction is exactly what moves vocabulary and grammar from your passive memory, where you can only recognize it, into your active memory, where you can actually produce it on demand.
So the reason repetition doesn't create fluency is because there's no friction. There's nothing forcing your brain to actually build the sentence itself.
Right. When you repeat, "I went to the store because I needed milk," your brain isn't building that sentence. It's just replaying audio, like a recording. But if I ask you, "Why do you think she went to the store?" and you don't know the answer yet, now your brain has to generate the sentence from scratch. It has to select the right verb, the right tense, the right connector word. That's friction. That's effortful retrieval. And effortful retrieval is scientifically one of the strongest predictors of long-term memory formation. This isn't just a language learning idea. It's actually well documented in cognitive psychology under a concept called the testing effect, or retrieval practice. The more effort your brain spends generating an answer rather than simply recognizing one, the stronger and more durable that memory becomes.
So basically, struggling a little bit is actually good for learning.
Struggling in the right way, with the right amount of difficulty, is exactly how real learning happens. It's uncomfortable in the moment, which is why so many learners avoid it, but it's the most efficient path to fluency that exists.
Okay, so now here's the big question. How do we actually create this cognitive friction on purpose? because most learners don't know how to do that. They just keep doing more listening, more repeating, hoping it'll eventually click.
This is exactly where the reverse storytelling technique comes in. And I want to explain the core idea simply before we get into the step-by-step mechanics in the next section. Here's the concept. Instead of telling a story from beginning to end, which is the natural, easy, low-friction way, we start at the climax, the most exciting or important moment of the story, and then we work backward. We ask why at every step, forcing ourselves to explain what happened just before that moment and the moment before that, all the way back to the very beginning.
So instead of saying, first this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and finally this was the result, we start with the result.
We start with the result, and then we have to justify it. Let's say the climax is, and that's how I completely missed my flight. Now, in a forward story, you'd naturally build up to that ending. But in reverse storytelling, you start there, and immediately your brain has to ask, wait, why did I miss my flight? And you have to generate the reason using proper English structure. Maybe, I had missed my flight because the taxi had gotten stuck in traffic. Notice that? Already we're using past perfect, had gotten stuck, because we're explaining something that happened before another past event. That's not a coincidence. That's the reverse method naturally pulling advanced grammar out of you, because logically, explaining a cause requires you to reference an earlier point in time.
That's honestly brilliant, because past perfect is one of those tenses learners are terrified of. They avoid it completely and just use simple past for everything.
Exactly. And that's the whole problem with traditional teaching. Grammar is taught as a rule to memorize. Past perfect is used for an action completed before another past action. And learners nod, write it down, pass the quiz, and then never use it again because there's no natural pressure pushing them to use it. But reverse storytelling creates that pressure organically. You're not thinking, I should use past perfect now. You're thinking, why did this happen? And the grammar just appears because it's the only logical way to express that idea.
So it's less about memorizing rules and more about creating situations where the rule is the only tool that fits the job.
That's a perfect way to put it, Bruce. Grammar becomes a tool for solving a communication problem instead of an abstract rule you're told to apply. And when grammar is learned as a tool that solves a real problem, even a small, story-based problem, it sticks. It becomes part of your active language system, not just something you recognize on a test.
Now, before we get into the full mechanics, and I know a lot of people watching are excited to actually learn the steps, I want to ask you something. Isn't this kind of similar to just asking why repeatedly, like the 5 whys technique people use in business or problem solving?
That's such a good observation. And yes, there's definitely a conceptual overlap. The 5 whys technique, which comes from Toyota's production system originally, is about asking why repeatedly to get to the root cause of a problem. Reverse storytelling borrows that same backward chaining logic, but applies it specifically to language production. The goal isn't just to find a root cause, it's to force your brain to generate full grammatical English sentences at every single step of that backward chain. Every why isn't just a question, it's a prompt for a complete, well-formed sentence using causal connectors, resultative phrasal verbs, and often more advanced tenses.
Resultative phrasal verbs. That's a term some learners might not be familiar with. Can you quickly touch on that before we move to the next section?
Sure, just to plant the seed here, because we'll go much deeper into it soon. Resultative phrasal verbs are phrasal verbs that describe the result or outcome of an action. Things like run out of, end up, figure out, wind up, burn out, break down. These are incredibly common in natural spoken English, but they're notoriously difficult for learners because their meaning isn't obvious from the individual words. You can't guess what end up means just by knowing end and up separately.
Right. I remember being so confused the first time someone said, I ended up staying home. I understood ended, and I understood up and staying home, but the whole phrase together confused me.
Exactly. And that's the thing. Dictionaries and textbooks list these phrasal verbs, but they rarely give learners a reason to actually use them. Reverse storytelling does. Because when you're explaining an outcome, how did the story end? Resultative phrasal verbs are often the most natural, most native sounding way to express that. So the method naturally pulls these high value phrases out of you, in context, connected to a real narrative you're building yourself.
Okay, I'm excited. I think everyone watching is ready for us to actually get into the mechanics now.
Let's do it. But before we move on, I want to leave you with this thought because I think it's the heart of everything we're going to talk about today. Fluency is not about knowing more words. Most intermediate learners already know thousands of words. Fluency is about building the mental pathways that let you retrieve and combine those words instantly, under pressure, without translating in your head first. And the fastest way to build those pathways is not more input. It's structured, effortful output, exactly the kind that reverse storytelling forces you to produce.
That's such an important reframe because I think a lot of learners believe the answer is always learn more vocabulary or watch more content. And what you're saying is, at a certain point, the bottleneck isn't what you know. It's whether you can access what you already know fast enough under real conversational pressure.
Exactly right. And now let's actually show you how to build that access step by step.
All right, Lily, let's get practical. Walk us through exactly how this works, step by step, because I know a lot of learners watching are ready to try this themselves right now.
Perfect. Let's do it live, actually. Let's build one together from scratch so everyone can see the process in real time. Bruce, give me a random everyday topic, something simple.
Okay, let's say I was late for work.
Great, simple, relatable topic. Now, in a traditional forward-moving story, we would start at the beginning. Something like, I woke up, I got dressed, I left the house, I got stuck in traffic, and I was late for work. That's a completely normal way to tell a story, and it's also incredibly low friction. Notice how easy that was for me to say? I didn't have to think hard at all. That's the problem.
Right, because you already know the ending before you even start.
Exactly. The ending is already decided, so there's no mental tension, no problem to solve. It's just a recall of events in the order they naturally happened, which mirrors the order they naturally exist in your memory. There's very little cognitive work involved.
So what does the reverse version look like?
Here's step one. We start at the climax, the final, most important moment. In this case, I was late for work. That's our starting point, our anchor.
Okay.
Step two, and this is the core engine of the entire technique. We ask why. Why was I late for work? And here's the rule. You're not allowed to just give a one-word or fragment answer. You must produce a full, grammatically complete English sentence that logically explains the previous statement. So I might say, I was late for work because I had missed the bus.
And there's that past perfect again. Had missed.
Exactly. And notice, I didn't consciously decide I will now use past perfect. The logic of the situation demanded it. Missing the bus happened before being late. Two past events, one before the other. So past perfect was the only grammatically correct choice to clearly show that sequence. If I had just said I missed the bus using simple past for both, it would still be understandable, but it wouldn't demonstrate the same level of grammatical sophistication that native speakers naturally use.
So step 3 would be asking why again, right? Why did you miss the bus?
Exactly. Step 3, we go one layer deeper. Why had I missed the bus? I had missed the bus because I had overslept. Notice, again, past perfect because oversleeping happened even earlier in the chain. We're building what I call a causal staircase. Each step goes further back in time, and each step requires slightly more complex grammar to correctly show that temporal relationship.
This is fascinating because you're not just telling a story, you're essentially building a chain of cause and effect, where each link has to be grammatically connected to the one before it.
That's it exactly. And here's step 4. We keep going. Why had I overslept? I had overslept because my alarm hadn't gone off. Now watch what's happening here. We're introducing a negative past perfect construction, hadn't gone off, which is even less commonly practiced by learners. Most learners can form positive past perfect sentences with some effort, but negative forms and question forms in past perfect are rarely practiced at all, simply because traditional exercises don't create a natural need for them.
So the deeper we go into this backward chain, the more advanced and specific the grammar naturally becomes.
Precisely. And this is one of the most beautiful parts of the technique. The difficulty scales itself automatically based on how deep you choose to go. If you're a beginner, you might only go 2 or 3 layers deep, using mostly simple past and 1 layer of past perfect. If you're more advanced, you can go 5, 6, 7 layers deep, pulling in conditionals, passive voice, modal verbs of speculation, all sorts of structures that would feel forced and artificial in a textbook exercise, but feel completely natural here because they're solving a real communication problem.
Let's keep going with this example actually, because I think seeing the full chain built out will really help people visualize it. Why hadn't your alarm gone off?
Great question. Let's say my alarm hadn't gone off because the power had gone out during the night. Now we've got a slightly more complex piece of information, an external event, the power outage, which is now the deepest layer of our explanation, going furthest back in time.
And that's essentially the inciting incident of the story, right? The actual root cause, so to speak.
Exactly. In storytelling terms, this is the inciting incident, the original event that set the entire chain of consequences into motion. In traditional forward storytelling, you would put this at the very beginning. Last night, the power went out. Because of that, my alarm didn't go off. Because I didn't hear my alarm, I overslept, and so on. But here's the key difference. When you build the story forward, you already know where it's going, so each step feels predictable, almost mechanical. But when you build it backward, from effect to cause, at every single step, you genuinely don't know what the why answer will be until you generate it yourself. There's real uncertainty, real problem solving at every layer.
That uncertainty is what creates the friction we talked about in the last section.
Exactly. That's the friction engine at work. Now here's an important nuance I want to add, because I don't want people to think this is only about grammar drilling. Once you've built your full backward chain, power outage, alarm didn't go off, overslept, missed the bus, late for work, the next step is to reverse it again and tell it forward, fluently in one smooth breath using everything you just constructed.
So you build backward first to force deep grammatical construction, and then you flip it forward to practice natural delivery.
Exactly right. And that combination is what makes this method so powerful. You get the deep cognitive processing benefits of backward construction, and then you get the natural rhythm and flow benefits of forward delivery, all from one single short story. Let me demonstrate the forward version now, using everything we built. Last night, the power went out, so my alarm didn't go off. Because I didn't hear it, I overslept, and that made me miss the bus. And since I missed the bus, I ended up being late for work.
Oh, and there's that resultative phrasal verb you mentioned earlier, ended up.
Exactly. I could have said, I was late for work again, but I ended up being late for work sounds far more natural, far more native. And here's something important. I didn't consciously insert that phrase to check a box. It came out naturally because by that point, I had already deeply processed the logical chain of causes through the reverse construction phase. My brain wasn't struggling to remember what happened. It was free to focus on making the delivery sound smooth and natural.
That's such an important point, because I think that's exactly what separates a fluent-sounding speaker from someone who's just grammatically correct. Fluent speakers aren't thinking about grammar while they speak. The grammar has already been processed, so all their mental energy goes toward natural rhythm, connecting words, and expression.
Exactly, and that's the entire goal of this technique, to front-load the hard grammatical processing during the reverse construction phase, so that when you deliver the story forward, your brain has the freedom to focus purely on sounding natural, rather than juggling grammar and vocabulary retrieval at the same time as trying to sound fluent. Trying to do both at once, generate correct grammar, and sound natural simultaneously in real time is exactly what causes that frozen, hesitant speech pattern so many learners struggle with.
So essentially, reverse storytelling separates two skills that are usually smashed together, grammatical construction and natural delivery, and lets you practice them one at a time, in sequence, instead of both at once, under pressure.
That's a beautifully clear way to summarize it, Bruce. And I want to highlight one more mechanical detail before we move to the next section, because it's something that trips people up when they first try this. When you're building the backward chain, avoid falling back into simple linear sentences just because they're easier. This is the biggest mistake beginners make with this technique. They ask why, and instead of producing a proper causal sentence, they just give a short fragment, like, "Why were you late?" Traffic. That's not enough. That fragment doesn't create friction, and it doesn't force any grammatical construction at all.
So the rule is, every single why answer has to be a complete, connected sentence using an actual causal connector. Because, since, due to the fact that, as a result of, something that links the two ideas grammatically.
Exactly. And ideally, as you get more comfortable, you push yourself to vary those connectors instead of using because every single time. Native speakers use a whole range of causal language, given that, seeing as, on account of, which meant that, which is why. And reverse storytelling gives you constant, repeated opportunities to practice swapping these connectors in and out in a real communicative context rather than in an isolated grammar drill.
I want to go back to something you said a moment ago about how this backward flow prevents your brain from relying on memorized scripts. Can you expand on that? Because I think that's actually one of the biggest hidden benefits of this whole method.
Absolutely. This might be my favorite part of the whole technique, honestly. Here's the issue with a lot of traditional speaking practice. Even role-play exercises, even describe your day prompts. Learners very quickly develop what I call memorized scripts. These are pre-built sentence chunks they've said so many times that they can produce them almost automatically without any real thought. Things like, my name is, I am from, I like to. These scripts feel like fluency because they come out smoothly and quickly, but they're actually a trap because the moment the conversation moves outside that memorized script, the learner freezes again because they never actually built the underlying skill of constructing new sentences in real time. They just memorized a fixed set of phrases.
That's so true, and I think a lot of learners don't even realize they're doing this. They think, I'm fluent because I can describe my morning routine perfectly. But that's because they've said that exact same description hundreds of times.
Exactly. It's fluency in a very narrow, rehearsed lane, not real, flexible, generative fluency. Now here's why reverse storytelling breaks this pattern completely. Because every single time you do this exercise, the specific why chain is unpredictable. Even if you use the same starting climax twice, your brain might generate a different reason the second time. There's no fixed script to memorize because the exercise, by design, forces new, spontaneous sentence construction every single time you do it. You cannot cheat this method with memorization because the backward logic changes based on the story you're building in that exact moment.
So it's almost impossible to fake fluency with this method. You either can construct the sentence in the moment, or you can't. And either way, you're training the actual skill you need.
Exactly right. And that's really the heart of why this technique is so effective, in my opinion. It removes the possibility of hiding behind memorized phrases and forces genuine, real-time language construction every single time.
Before we move to the next section, I want to do a mini exercise with the audience, if that's all right with you.
I love that idea. Let's do it. So here's a mini exercise for everyone watching. Pause the video for a moment after we explain this and try it yourself. Here's your climax sentence, and that's how I ended up making a completely new friend. Your job, work backward. Ask yourself why. Build at least 3 layers deep using full sentences and past perfect where it's needed, and then flip it forward into one smooth, connected story.
And if you want, share your version in the comments below. Lily and I would genuinely love to read them and see how creative you can get with this.
We really would. And I'll say this, don't worry about getting it perfect on your first try. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is friction. The goal is forcing your brain to do the work. Mistakes are actually a sign that the technique is working because it means you're pushing past your comfortable, memorized zone into new, generative territory.
All right, now that we understand the core mechanics, starting at the climax, asking why repeatedly, building full grammatical sentences at each layer, and then flipping the chain forward for natural delivery, let's go one level deeper into the actual linguistic logic this method triggers. Because I know a lot of learners are curious specifically about grammar structures like past perfect and conditionals.
Yes, let's move into that next, because this is where the real transformation happens for intermediate learners who are stuck at that plateau, unable to move into advanced, natural-sounding English. Okay, so let's talk about why this why prompt at every reverse step is so powerful for pulling out complex grammar, specifically things like past perfect and conditional moods, which are 2 of the structures learners avoid the most.
Before we dig into the grammar specifically, can you explain why learners avoid these structures in the first place? Because I think understanding the why behind the avoidance will help people see exactly how reverse storytelling solves the problem.
That's a great place to start. So think about how most learners are taught past perfect. Usually, it's presented as an isolated grammar point, a chapter in a textbook. Past perfect is formed with had plus the past participle, and it's used to describe an action that happened before another past action. Then there are some fill-in-the-blank exercises. She, finish, her homework before dinner. You write, had finished. You check the answer key, you move on.
Right, and that's basically the extent of most people's past perfect practice.
Exactly. And here's the fundamental problem. That exercise tests recognition and mechanical form filling, but it doesn't test whether you can generate a past perfect sentence spontaneously from your own thoughts under real communicative pressure. There's a massive difference between filling in a blank in a sentence someone else already wrote and constructing an entirely new sentence from scratch in a live conversation, because the logic of what you're saying genuinely requires that structure.
So it's the difference between recognizing the right tool in a toolbox someone hands you versus knowing which tool to grab yourself when you're facing a real problem.
That's exactly it. And because learners rarely get real practice with that second skill, spontaneous generation, past perfect ends up living purely in their passive knowledge. They can recognize it when they read it or hear it. They might even get the textbook exercise right. But when they're speaking freely, they default to simple past for everything because simple past is easier to access and doesn't require holding two time references in mind simultaneously.
So how does reverse storytelling specifically fix this?
Because of the structure of the why question itself. Think about it logically. When you ask, why did X happen, and X is already in the past, the answer, by definition, describes something that happened even earlier, an earlier point in the past. That's the exact grammatical situation past perfect was created for. So the method doesn't teach past perfect as an abstract rule. It creates a situation where past perfect is the only logically correct tool, and your brain, trying to solve a real communication problem, naturally reaches for it.
It's almost like the grammar becomes invisible. You're not thinking, now I need past perfect. You're thinking, how do I explain what happened before this? And past perfect just falls out of that thought process.
Exactly. And this is actually backed by a well-established idea in second language acquisition research called form-meaning mapping. Grammar structures are learned most durably when learners repeatedly encounter, or in this case, produce, a specific form while simultaneously processing the specific meaning or communicative function that form serves. When the form and the function are experienced together, repeatedly, in real communicative contexts, the connection between them becomes automatic. Reverse storytelling creates dozens of these form-meaning pairings in a single short exercise, because every single why question at every layer creates another opportunity to map the form of past perfect onto its actual communicative function, explaining an earlier past event.
Let's talk about conditionals now, because I know that's another structure a lot of intermediate learners struggle with, especially the second and third conditional.
Yes, and conditionals actually emerge really naturally from this technique too, especially when you push your reverse chain toward more abstract or emotional causes rather than purely factual ones. Let's build a quick example together. Bruce, give me another climax.
Let's try. And that's how I ended up getting the promotion.
Great! Nice positive example this time. So, layer 1, why did I get the promotion? I got the promotion because I had taken the initiative to lead the new project. Notice past perfect again, had taken, because taking initiative happened before getting the promotion.
Makes sense.
Now, layer 2, why had I taken the initiative? Here's where it gets interesting, because sometimes the honest answer to why isn't a simple fact. It's a reflection, a hypothetical, a piece of reasoning. I might say, I had taken the initiative because I knew that if I hadn't stepped up, someone else would have taken the opportunity. Now look at what just happened. If I hadn't stepped up, someone else would have taken the opportunity. That's a third conditional structure used completely naturally to explain a hypothetical alternative reality that motivated my real decision.
Wow. And again, you didn't set out to use third conditional. It just emerged because you were explaining your reasoning, your internal motivation.
Precisely. And this is such a powerful demonstration of why reverse storytelling reaches deeper linguistic structures than forward storytelling typically does. Forward storytelling tends to stay factual. This happened, then this happened. But reverse storytelling, especially once you get past the first couple of layers and start asking about motivations, feelings, and reasoning, naturally pulls you into hypothetical and conditional thinking, because humans often explain their decisions by comparing what did happen to what could have happened. That comparison is exactly what conditional structures exist to express.
This actually makes me think about how conditionals are taught traditionally, usually with somewhat artificial example sentences, like, if I had studied harder, I would have passed the exam, which is a fine example, but it's disconnected from any real personal story.
Exactly. And disconnected grammar, no matter how logical the rule is, tends to fade from memory because there's no emotional or personal anchor holding it in place. But when you generate a conditional sentence yourself about your own invented story, connected to a real emotional stake, even if the story itself is fictional or hypothetical, your brain treats that sentence very differently than a textbook example. There's personal investment, there's narrative context, and both of those significantly boost memory retention.
Now, I want to ask about something you mentioned briefly earlier, the neurological benefit of reconstruction over repetition. Can you go deeper into what's actually happening in the brain here? Because I think some learners want to understand the why behind why this works, not just trust me, it works.
Absolutely. And I think that's a completely fair thing to want to understand. So here's the core neuroscience concept at play, explained simply. When you repeat something you just heard, your brain is primarily using what's sometimes called shallow processing. You're recognizing sounds and matching them to patterns, but you're not deeply engaging with the meaning or structure of what you're saying. It's a bit like copying a sentence by tracing over it versus writing that same sentence from memory.
Tracing versus freehand writing. That's such a clear image.
Right. And when you reconstruct something, meaning you have to generate it yourself using your own reasoning, your own word choices, your own grammatical decisions, your brain engages in what's called deep processing. Deep processing involves multiple cognitive systems working together simultaneously. Your semantic memory, which stores word meanings, your working memory, which holds the pieces of the sentence you're building in mind while you construct the rest, and your executive function, which manages the logical structure and sequencing of your explanation.
So reconstruction is basically a full brain workout, while repetition is more like a light stretch.
That's a great way to put it. And the reason deep processing creates such durable memories is connected to something researchers call elaborative encoding. Basically, the more connections your brain makes between a new piece of information and things it already knows, other memories, emotions, logical relationships, personal experiences, the stronger and more retrievable that memory becomes later. When you reconstruct a story backward, asking why at every step, you're forcing your brain to constantly connect new grammatical structures to logical reasoning, personal narrative, and cause and effect relationships. That's an enormous amount of elaborative encoding happening in just a few minutes of practice.
Whereas simple repetition doesn't create any of those extra connections. It's just replaying the same information without adding any new links to it.
Exactly. And that's fundamentally why learners can repeat phrases for months, even years, and still feel like those phrases never truly stick in their active, spontaneous speech. There simply aren't enough meaningful connections holding that information in place for fast, flexible retrieval.
I think it would be really valuable right now to do a full, real-time example transforming a boring, everyday anecdote into a cognitively demanding reverse storytelling exercise, just so people can see the entire process, start to finish, in one clean example.
I love that idea. Let's use a scenario almost everyone can relate to, losing your phone.
Perfect. Very relatable.
Okay, so here's the boring forward version first, the version most learners would naturally tell. Yesterday, I lost my phone. I looked everywhere for it. Eventually, I found it under my bed. That's it. That's a complete story, technically, but notice how low effort it is. Every sentence is simple past, every sentence is short, and there's very little vocabulary variety or grammatical complexity. This is what I call a flat story. It communicates the facts, but it does almost nothing to build your active language skills.
Right. And I think this is genuinely how most learners describe their day, even at an intermediate level. Short, flat, simple past sentences strung together.
Exactly. So now let's transform this into a reverse storytelling exercise. Climax. And that's how I finally found my phone under my bed. Layer 1, why did I find it under my bed? I found it under my bed because I had finally decided to check every single spot in my room, no matter how unlikely. Notice, again, past perfect, had decided. And also notice, this sentence is far richer than the original flat version. No matter how unlikely, adds nuance and natural spoken rhythm.
Definitely more expressive already.
Layer 2. Why had I decided to check every spot? I had decided to check everywhere because I had already spent almost an hour searching the obvious places, like my bag and my desk, without any luck. Look how much detail is naturally emerging here. Spent almost an hour without any luck. These are natural, idiomatic expressions that wouldn't have appeared at all in the flat, forward version of the story.
It's incredible how much richer the story becomes purely because you're being forced to justify each step.
Layer 3. Why had I spent an hour searching the obvious places first? I had searched the obvious places first because that's usually where I end up finding things, so I hadn't even considered looking under the bed until I ran out of other options. And there it is, ran out of, another resultative phrasal verb, appearing completely naturally because I'm explaining a logical progression of decision-making, not just reciting facts.
So, if we flip this whole chain forward now into one smooth story, what does it sound like?
Let's do it. Yesterday, I couldn't find my phone anywhere, so I searched all the obvious places first, my bag, my desk, but I had no luck. Since I'd already spent almost an hour looking without any success, I finally ran out of options and decided to check every single spot in my room, no matter how unlikely. And that's how I ended up finding my phone under my bed.
That is such a massive difference from the original three-sentence version. It's got past perfect, resultative phrasal verbs, natural connectors like since and so, and it genuinely sounds like something a fluent English speaker would say casually.
And here's the most important part. I didn't sit down and plan to include a resultative phrasal verb or plan to use past perfect twice. All of that emerged naturally from the process of justifying each step backward. That's the real magic of this technique. It doesn't ask you to memorize which structures to use. It creates situations where those structures are simply the most natural, logical choice, and your brain reaches for them automatically because it's solving a genuine communication problem, not completing a grammar drill.
I think this section alone completely reframes how I think about grammar practice. It's not about memorizing rules in isolation, it's about creating situations where those rules become necessary tools for expressing real thoughts.
Exactly. And once you start seeing grammar that way, as tools that solve communication problems, rather than rules to memorize, everything about language learning becomes more intuitive and, honestly, a lot more enjoyable, too.
Before we move to the next section, I do want to pause here for a second because I know some of you have been really enjoying this lesson so far. And I just want to say, if you are enjoying this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more English learning videos like this one. It genuinely helps us keep making deep, practical content like this.
It really does. And if you'd like even more English listening and speaking practice beyond this video, be sure to check out our podcast playlist on this channel. You'll find many useful lessons there, designed to help you improve your English naturally through real conversations just like this one.
All right, now let's move into something I think a lot of people are going to find really exciting: how this backward building process actually helps you sound more natural, more rhythmic, less robotic when you speak.
Yes, let's talk about natural speech rhythm next, because grammar accuracy is only half the picture. The other half is sounding like a real, natural speaker, and reverse storytelling has a surprising, almost hidden benefit for that too.
Okay, Lily. So we've talked a lot about grammar and logic so far, but I know a huge concern for a lot of learners is simply sounding natural, not robotic, not overly formal, just normal, the way a real person actually talks.
Yes, and this is honestly one of my favorite hidden benefits of this technique because most learners don't expect it at all. They come into this thinking, okay, this will help my grammar, but they don't realize it also dramatically improves their rhythm, their stress patterns, and their overall natural flow.
So let's start with stress. Why does working backward naturally highlight the stressed words in a sentence?
Great question. So first, let's quickly remind everyone what sentence stress even is for anyone newer to this concept. In English, we don't say every word with equal emphasis. Certain words, usually the words carrying the most important, new information, get stressed. They're said slightly louder, slightly longer, sometimes slightly higher in pitch. Other words, usually small grammatical words like a, the, is, to, get reduced, said quickly and quietly, almost swallowed.
Right. And this stress pattern is honestly one of the biggest things that separates a natural-sounding speaker from someone who sounds like they're reading a list of words with no melody at all.
Exactly. And here's the connection to reverse storytelling. When you build a story backward using the why method, every single sentence you produce is centered around answering a specific question, a specific piece of new, important information. Think about it. When I say, I was late for work because I had missed the bus, the most important new piece of information in that sentence is miss the bus. That's the actual answer to the question. Everything else, I was late for work because I had, is essentially grammatical scaffolding, holding that key piece of information in place.
So the answer to the why question is naturally the part of the sentence that should be stressed.
Exactly. And here's the beautiful part. Because reverse storytelling is fundamentally built around a repeated question and answer structure, why, and then a direct answer, it constantly, naturally highlights exactly which part of each sentence carries the new important information. This is very different from forward storytelling, where sentences often blend together into a long, flat sequence of facts, with no single clear answer point standing out in each sentence.
That's such an interesting distinction. So basically, the question and answer structure of the technique inherently teaches you where to place stress, without anyone explicitly teaching you a stress rule.
Exactly right. And I want to actually demonstrate this out loud because stress is something that's genuinely easier to hear than to explain in words alone. Let's go back to our missed bus example. When I answer the why question, listen to how naturally my voice emphasizes the key word. I was late for work because I had missed the bus. Do you hear how bus gets a little extra weight, a little extra emphasis?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not something you're forcing. It comes out naturally because that's literally the answer to the question you just asked yourself.
Exactly. And this happens at every single layer of the reverse chain, which means every single sentence you produce during this exercise naturally reinforces correct, native-like stress placement completely automatically without any separate pronunciation drilling required.
Now, let's talk about something else you mentioned, layering in filler fluency markers. I think this is something a lot of learners either avoid completely, thinking it sounds unprofessional, or they overuse in a way that sounds unnatural. Can you explain what you mean by this in the context of this technique?
Yes, this is such an important and often misunderstood topic. So first, let's clarify. When I say filler fluency markers, I'm talking about small words and phrases native speakers naturally use to bridge their thoughts while speaking spontaneously. Things like, well, I mean, actually, so basically, let's see, kind of, sort of. These aren't signs of poor English. They're actually signs of natural, spontaneous, real-time speech production.
Right, because when native speakers talk, they're not reciting a pre-written script. They're thinking and speaking at the same time, and these fillers give their brain a tiny bit of extra processing time without creating an awkward silent pause.
Exactly. And here's the connection to our method. Once you've built your reverse chain and flipped it forward into a full story, the next stage of practice is to deliver that story again. But this time, allow yourself to naturally insert these filler markers exactly where a real speaker's brain would need a tiny moment to organize the next thought. For example, instead of saying, "I was late for work because I had missed the bus," you might say, "So, I was late for work. Basically, I had missed the bus."
And that actually sounds more natural, more spontaneous, even though grammatically, it's the exact same core information.
Precisely. And here's why this step matters so much, especially at this stage of the process and not earlier. If you try to add fillers during the initial backward construction phase, while you're still working hard to figure out the grammar and logic, it actually creates unnecessary extra cognitive load and can slow down your learning of the core structures. But once the backward chain is built and you're simply flipping it forward, your brain has plenty of spare processing capacity to layer in these natural fluency markers because the hard grammatical work is already done.
So there's actually a deliberate order to this. Grammar and logic first, in the backward phase, and then rhythm and naturalness second, in the forward delivery phase.
Exactly. And I think this order is honestly one of the most overlooked, yet most important parts of this entire method. A lot of fluency techniques try to get learners to sound natural and be grammatically accurate at the exact same time, from the very first attempt. And that's simply too much cognitive load for most learners to handle simultaneously. It's like trying to learn how to shift gears in a car and steer smoothly through traffic at the exact same moment you're first learning to drive. It's much more effective to separate those skills, master them individually, and then blend them together once each one feels more automatic on its own.
I really like that comparison because it makes it clear why so many fluency methods fail. They're asking learners to do too many difficult things at once, right from the very beginning.
Exactly. And that leads us into the final and honestly one of the most exciting parts of this whole rhythm building process, the transition from slow, deliberate, logical reconstruction all the way to fast, rapid-fire, natural delivery.
Yes, let's talk about that transition, because I think a lot of people are wondering, okay, this backward building process sounds slow and deliberate. How does it eventually lead to fast, natural speech?
So here's how the progression works, and I want to walk through this very clearly because it's genuinely the bridge between understanding the technique and actually becoming fluent using it. In your very first attempts at reverse storytelling, you should go slowly, deliberately, even pausing between each why question and answer if you need to. At this stage, the goal is not speed. The goal is correct construction. You want to give your brain enough time and space to properly build each past perfect sentence, each causal connector, each resultative phrasal verb without rushing and falling back into simple, flat sentences out of panic.
So round one is all about accuracy and depth, even if it feels slow.
Exactly. Slow is completely fine, even expected, in the early stages. But here's what happens next, and this is really the core insight of the entire progression. Once you've built and flipped a story backward and forward a few times, something remarkable happens. The specific sentence structures you generated, the specific past perfect forms, the specific connectors, the specific phrasal verbs start to feel familiar. Not memorized exactly, because remember, every reverse chain is somewhat unique, but the underlying patterns start to feel like tools you've genuinely used yourself, rather than rules you read about once in a textbook.
So the next round of practice, you can go faster because your brain isn't starting completely from zero anymore.
Precisely. And this is where I recommend a specific practice structure. After you build your first reverse story slowly, deliberately, I want you to immediately do it again. But this time, aim to deliver the full forward version, start to climax, in one smooth, continuous breath without long pauses. Time yourself if you want to add a little extra motivation. The first time might take you 20-25 seconds with hesitation, but because you've already done the hard cognitive work of constructing the logic and you're just re-delivering it, you'll find that second, third, fourth attempt gets progressively faster and smoother, often dramatically so.
It's almost like you're doing reps, similar to physical training. First rep slow and deliberate, focused on correct form, and then subsequent reps get faster as your body, or in this case your brain, becomes more comfortable with the movement.
That's exactly the right way to think about it. And I'd actually encourage everyone watching to literally do multiple reps of the same reverse story. Build it backward once, slowly. Then deliver it forward 3, 4, even 5 times, each time trying to increase your speed slightly while keeping the grammar and vocabulary intact. You'll be amazed at how much smoother and more automatic your fifth attempt sounds compared to your first.
I think this is such valuable, actionable advice because a lot of learners think fluency practice means always doing something new, always generating fresh content. But what you're describing is almost the opposite, deliberately repeating the same reconstructed story multiple times, specifically to build speed and automaticity.
Exactly. And I want to be clear, this isn't a contradiction of what we said earlier about avoiding memorized scripts. Repeating the same story 5 times in a row, right after you've built it yourself through genuine cognitive effort, is completely different from memorizing a script written by someone else and repeating that indefinitely. In this case, you've already done the hard work of generating the content yourself, so the repetition is purely serving a speed and rhythm-building purpose, not replacing the deeper cognitive construction process.
That's a really important distinction, and I think it'll help a lot of learners feel more confident about repeating their own reverse stories multiple times without worrying they're falling into the same trap we talked about at the very beginning of this video.
Exactly. The trap is repeating someone else's pre-built sentences without ever generating anything yourself. Repeating your own self-generated content, specifically to build speed, is a completely different and genuinely valuable part of the process.
So just to summarize this section before we move forward, reverse storytelling naturally teaches correct sentence stress because every sentence answers a specific why question, highlighting the important new information automatically. It also gives you a natural, structured way to layer in fluency markers, but only after the core grammar and logic has already been constructed. And finally, the technique naturally scales from slow, deliberate construction toward fast, rapid, natural-sounding delivery through deliberate repetition of your own self-generated stories.
Perfectly summarized, Bruce. And now I think it's time to bring everything we've talked about together into something genuinely actionable, a full framework you can follow starting today to build this skill systematically over the next 30 days.
All right, this is the part I know a lot of people have been waiting for. We've explained the theory, we've explained the mechanics, we've shown real examples. Now let's build an actual practical schedule people can follow.
Yes, and I want to be really clear about something before we start. This isn't meant to be rigid. Life happens. Some days you'll be busy, some days you'll have more energy than others. But having a structure, even a flexible one, dramatically increases the chance that you'll actually stick with this long enough to see real results. And 30 days is genuinely enough time to notice a significant, measurable shift in how quickly you can access complex grammar and vocabulary while speaking.
So let's break this down week by week. What does week 1 look like for someone brand new to this technique?
Week 1 is all about foundations, getting comfortable with the basic mechanics of the backward chain without worrying too much yet about speed or advanced structures. I recommend, for days 1 through 7, doing just one reverse story per day, but doing it thoroughly. Choose a simple, everyday climax, something like, "And that's how I missed my bus," "And that's how I found $20 in my old jacket," "And that's how I ended up cooking dinner for my neighbor." Keep the topics light, personal, and low pressure during this first week.
And in terms of depth, how many why layers should someone aim for during week 1?
I'd say 2 to 3 layers is perfectly appropriate for week 1. Remember, the goal at this stage isn't complexity for its own sake. It's building comfort with the process itself. Start at the climax, ask why once, build a full past perfect sentence if the logic calls for it, ask why again, build another layer, and then flip the whole thing forward into a smooth, connected story. Do this once per day, and I genuinely recommend recording yourself doing it, even just using your phone's voice recorder. You don't need to share it with anyone. It's simply an accountability and progress tracking tool for yourself.
That's such a good tip, actually, because I think a lot of learners underestimate how motivating it is to listen back to a recording from 2 weeks ago and hear how much smoother and more confident they sound now.
Exactly. And that's precisely why week 1 includes daily recording, not for anyone else, purely for your own future comparison. Now, moving into week 2, days 8 through 14, this is where we start adding a bit more depth and variety. I recommend pushing your reverse chains to 3 or 4 layers deep now and start deliberately varying your causal connectors. Instead of using because every single time, challenge yourself to use since, as, given that, or seeing as at least once per story.
And should the topics get more complex during week 2 as well? Or should they still be personal, everyday situations?
I'd say keep them personal still, because personal relevance really does boost memory retention. But you can start introducing slightly more emotional or opinion-based climaxes rather than purely factual ones. Instead of just, "And that's how I missed my bus," try something like, "And that's how I finally decided to change my career," or, "And that's how I realized I needed to apologize to my friend." These kinds of climaxes naturally push you toward more reflective, reasoning-based language, which, as we discussed earlier, tends to pull in conditional structures and more nuanced vocabulary.
That makes sense, because those more emotional or decision-based topics require you to explain motivation, not just sequence of events.
Exactly right. Now, week 3, days 15 through 21, this is where I introduce what I call topic randomization, using external prompts rather than always generating your own climax sentence. This is actually where AI tools become incredibly useful, and I want to spend a moment explaining exactly how to use them for this purpose, because I think this is a detail a lot of learners will find genuinely practical.
Yes, let's talk about that, because I know a lot of people watching use AI tools already for various things, but maybe haven't thought about using them specifically for this kind of practice.
So here's exactly what I recommend. Open any AI chat tool you already have access to and give it a simple prompt like this. Give me one short, surprising sentence describing the end result of a story without telling me how it happened. Keep it under 15 words. The AI will generate something like, "And that's how I accidentally became the only witness to a robbery," or, "And that's how I ended up learning to play the violin at 40 years old." These unpredictable climax prompts are incredibly valuable because remember, one of the core benefits of this technique is that unpredictability itself creates cognitive friction. If you always generate your own climax sentences, there's a risk over time that you unconsciously start choosing topics you already feel comfortable explaining.
That's such a smart use of AI tools, because it essentially gives you an infinite, unpredictable source of practice prompts without you having to spend mental energy inventing new scenarios yourself every single day.
Exactly. And I'd recommend, during week 3, generating 3 to 5 fresh climax prompts using an AI tool at the start of each practice session, and then working through at least 2 of them per day, pushing your reverse chains to 4 or 5 layers deep now. By this point, you should be noticing that the process feels noticeably faster and less effortful than it did in week 1. Not because the exercise itself has gotten easier, but because your brain has genuinely built stronger pathways for this kind of backward causal reasoning in English.
And what about week 4, the final week? What changes there?
Week 4 is where everything comes together. And this is where I want you to start focusing heavily on the forward delivery speed we talked about in the previous section. By this point, you should be very comfortable with the backward construction process itself, so the primary focus of week 4 shifts toward rapid-fire forward delivery. For each story, after building your reverse chain, deliver the forward version out loud at least 3 times in a row, each time trying to increase your speed slightly while maintaining correct grammar and natural stress patterns. I'd also recommend, during week 4, occasionally challenging yourself with more abstract, argument-based climax prompts rather than purely narrative ones. Things like, "And that's why I believe remote work is better for most people," or, "And that's why I think this movie was overrated." These kinds of opinion-based climaxes push you toward using this same backward causal reasoning skill in argumentative or persuasive contexts, which is an incredibly valuable, transferable skill for real conversations, debates, and even professional discussions in English.
That's such a great extension of the technique, because it shows that this isn't just useful for telling personal stories, it's genuinely useful for structuring any kind of explanation or argument in English.
Exactly. Because at its core, this technique is really about training causal reasoning and logical sequencing in English, and that skill applies far beyond just storytelling. It applies to explaining a decision at work, justifying an opinion in a debate, or even just answering a simple, "Why do you think that?" question in a casual conversation.
Now, I want to touch on something practical. How long should each daily practice session actually take? Because I think some learners might assume this requires a huge time commitment, which could discourage them from even starting.
That's such an important point to clarify, because honestly, this technique is remarkably time efficient. A single, thorough reverse storytelling session, building the backward chain, and then delivering the forward version 2 or 3 times genuinely only takes about 10 to 15 minutes. I always recommend consistency over duration. Doing 10 focused minutes every single day for 30 days will produce dramatically better results than doing one exhausting 2-hour session once a week and then skipping the rest of the time.
That's really reassuring for people who feel like they don't have much extra time in their schedule for language learning.
Absolutely. And honestly, I think that's part of why this technique is so effective as a long-term habit. It's genuinely sustainable. 10 to 15 minutes a day is something almost anyone can fit into their schedule, whether that's first thing in the morning, during a lunch break, or right before bed.
Let's talk about common mistakes now, because I think it would be genuinely helpful for people to know what pitfalls to avoid as they start this 30-day journey.
Yes, this is important. Let's go through a few of the most common mistakes I've seen learners make with this technique. Mistake number 1, which we touched on earlier, but I want to emphasize again, giving short, fragment answers to the why question instead of full grammatical sentences. If you ask yourself, "Why was I late?" and you just think, "Traffic," that's not enough. You have to force yourself to build the complete sentence. "I was late because the traffic had been much worse than usual." That extra step is where all the real learning happens, so don't skip it, even when it feels slower or more tedious.
What's mistake number 2?
Mistake number 2 is stopping too early, only going one layer deep. If you ask why just once and then stop, you're missing out on a huge amount of the cognitive benefit of this technique. Remember, Each additional layer pushes you toward more advanced grammar and more specific vocabulary. I always recommend a minimum of 2 layers, even on your busiest days, and ideally 3 to 5 layers once you're past the first week.
And mistake number 3?
Mistake number 3, and this one is subtle but really important, always using because as your only connector. I understand because feels safe and comfortable, but if you rely on it exclusively, you're missing an opportunity to practice the wider range of causal language that native speakers actually use in natural conversation. Make a conscious effort, especially from week 2 onward, to rotate through different connectors. Since, given that, due to the fact that, which is why, as a result of. This small habit alone will make your English sound noticeably more sophisticated and natural.
Those are all really practical, specific things to watch out for. Is there a fourth mistake you commonly see?
Yes, actually, mistake number 4 is skipping the forward delivery phase entirely. Some learners get so focused on the backward construction process, which admittedly is intellectually satisfying because it feels like solving a puzzle, that they forget to actually flip the story forward and practice delivering it smoothly and naturally. Remember, the backward phase builds the grammatical skeleton, but the forward phase is where you actually train natural, fluent delivery. Skipping it means you're only getting half the benefit of this technique.
That's such a great point, because I think it's genuinely tempting to stop once you've built the interesting, complex backward chain, since that part does feel like the hard work is done.
Exactly. But the forward delivery is honestly just as important, if not more important, for actually improving your spontaneous speaking ability, which is the whole point of this entire method.
Now, before we wrap up this section, I want to touch on one more practical tip you mentioned in our outline, using AI tools not just for climax prompts, but potentially for feedback as well. Can you expand on that?
Absolutely. And this is actually a really valuable, underused application. Once you've built your forward story out loud, you can type it out, or even use a voice-to-text tool to transcribe what you said and paste it into an AI chat tool with a prompt like, "Please check this short story for grammar mistakes and suggest 1 or 2 ways I could make it sound more natural or native-like." This gives you immediate, personalized feedback on your own self-generated content, which is honestly something that used to require a human tutor, and now can be accessed instantly, for free or very low cost, at any time of day.
That's such a powerful combination, using AI for unpredictable practice prompts and then using it again afterward for feedback on your own output. It essentially creates a complete practice loop, entirely on your own.
Exactly. And I really want to emphasize, this doesn't replace real human conversation practice. Nothing truly replaces that, but it's an incredibly valuable supplement, especially for learners who don't always have access to a conversation partner or tutor every single day. It keeps the practice consistent, which, as we talked about, is really the most important factor for long-term progress.
So, to bring this 30-day framework together, Week 1 is about building comfort with the basic mechanics, 2 to 3 layers deep, personal, everyday topics. Week 2 adds more depth, more connector variety, and slightly more emotional or decision-based topics. Week 3 introduces AI-generated, unpredictable climax prompts and pushes toward 4 to 5 layers. And Week 4 shifts the focus toward rapid, natural forward delivery, plus more abstract, opinion-based topics.
Exactly. And by the end of that 30-day period, if you've been consistent, even just with those 10 to 15 minutes a day, you will notice a genuinely measurable difference in how quickly complex grammar and natural vocabulary come to you while speaking. Not because you memorized more words, but because you've built real, active retrieval pathways through consistent, structured, effortful practice.
I think it's time now for the challenge you mentioned right at the very beginning of this video.
Yes, let's do it. So here's my challenge to every single person watching this video right now. Don't wait until tomorrow. Don't wait until the right moment. Right now, pause this video for just 5 minutes and build your very first reverse story. Pick any climax. It can be something that genuinely happened to you today or something completely made up. It doesn't matter. Ask yourself why at least twice, build full sentences at each layer, and then flip it forward and say it out loud, even if no one else hears it.
And I genuinely mean this. The difference you'll feel between your first attempt and your third or fourth attempt, even within the same short session, is remarkable. You'll feel your brain shift from hesitant, translated thinking into more direct, logical English construction.
Exactly. And if you want to share your first reverse story, drop it in the comments below. Bruce and I both genuinely read through comments, and we'd love to see what climax sentence you chose and how deep you managed to build your reverse chain.
Before we wrap up completely, I actually want to spend some extra time here because I think seeing multiple examples at different levels of difficulty will really help solidify this technique for everyone watching. Is that all right with you?
I love that idea, honestly, because I think one example, no matter how detailed, isn't always enough for people to feel truly confident trying this on their own. Let's do a few more at different levels.
Let's start with a beginner-level example. Something very simple, using basic vocabulary, but still showing the core mechanics clearly.
Perfect. Let's use this climax. And that's how I got wet on my way to school. Very simple, very concrete. Layer 1. Why did I get wet? I got wet because it had started raining while I was walking. Simple past perfect, clear and understandable, even for a lower intermediate learner. Layer 2. Why hadn't I brought an umbrella if it was raining? Let's frame it that way. I hadn't brought an umbrella because the weather forecast hadn't mentioned any rain that morning. And there we go. Negative past perfect used twice in a very simple everyday context.
And the forward version?
This morning, the weather forecast hadn't mentioned any rain, so I didn't bring an umbrella. But it started raining while I was walking to school, and that's how I ended up getting completely wet. Simple, clear, but noticeably more sophisticated than a beginner would typically produce on their own without this structure.
That's a great, accessible example for true beginners. Now let's try something at an intermediate level, maybe with a slightly more complex emotional angle.
Let's use this climax. And that's how I ended up apologizing to my sister after 3 years of not speaking. Layer 1. Why did I apologize after 3 years? I finally apologized because I had realized that holding on to anger was hurting me more than it was hurting her. Notice the more abstract, reflective language here. Holding on to anger, hurting me more than it was hurting her. This is a noticeably richer sentence than our beginner example.
Definitely. And I imagine layer 2 would push even further into that emotional reasoning.
Exactly. Layer 2. Why had I realized that? I had come to that realization after a close friend of mine had pointed out that I brought up the same argument every single time we talked, even though the actual disagreement had happened years earlier. Now we've got multiple layers of past perfect stacked together, plus a natural example of a friend's advice acting as a catalyst for a personal realization, a very common, very human narrative structure.
And what would the forward version sound like, pulling all of that together?
A close friend of mine had pointed out that I kept bringing up the same argument every time we talked, even though it had happened years earlier. That comment made me realize that holding on to the anger was hurting me more than it was hurting my sister. So, after 3 years of silence, I finally reached out and apologized.
That's genuinely moving, and I think it shows how this technique isn't limited to simple, mundane stories. It scales beautifully into much more meaningful, personal narratives, too.
Exactly. And honestly, I'd encourage learners, once they're comfortable with the basics, to lean into these more emotionally significant topics because the personal investment genuinely does strengthen memory retention, exactly like we discussed earlier with elaborative encoding.
Let's do one more example, but this time, let's go fully into the abstract, opinion-based territory you mentioned for week 4 of the framework.
Great idea. Let's use this climax. And that's why I believe traveling alone at least once is essential for personal growth. Layer 1. Why do I believe that? I believe that because traveling alone forces you to solve problems that you would normally rely on someone else to handle. Notice this is present tense reasoning now, since we're dealing with a general belief, not a specific past narrative, so the grammar naturally shifts to reflect that.
Right. And that's actually a really valuable point. The technique isn't rigidly locked into past tense storytelling. It adapts to whatever kind of explanation you're building.
Exactly. And layer 2, why does solving problems alone matter so much for personal growth? It matters because when there's no one else to fall back on, you're forced to trust your own judgment, and that builds a kind of confidence that simply can't be built any other way. Notice the conditional-like structure emerging here too. When there's no one else to fall back on, you're forced to trust your own judgment. A zero conditional, expressing a general truth, which is yet another grammatical structure this technique naturally pulls out of you, depending on the nature of the climax you choose.
That's incredible. It really does show how flexible and how deep this technique can go, depending on what kind of climax sentence you start with.
Exactly. And that flexibility is honestly one of the reasons I believe this technique has genuine long-term value, rather than being a one-time trick. You can use it for simple daily narratives, deeply personal emotional stories, or abstract opinions and arguments. And in every single case, it naturally pulls out more advanced, more natural English than a standard forward-moving explanation would.
Now, I want to shift into a bit of a Q&A format, because I know, based on the outline and based on common questions learners ask about techniques like this, there are probably a few concerns people watching might have. Can we go through a few of those?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
First question. What if someone's English level is still fairly basic? Is this technique too advanced for a true beginner?
That's a really fair question, and honestly, I'd say this technique works best for learners who already have a foundational grasp of simple past tense and basic sentence structure, so roughly low intermediate and above. If you're an absolute beginner, still learning basic present tense and simple vocabulary, I'd recommend spending a little more time building that foundation first. But the moment you're comfortable forming simple past sentences, even imperfectly, you can absolutely start using a simplified version of this technique, sticking to just 1 or 2 layers deep, focusing purely on simple past and basic past perfect, without worrying about conditionals or more advanced structures yet.
That's really helpful context. Second question, how do you know if you're doing this correctly? Is there a risk of practicing incorrect grammar repeatedly and reinforcing mistakes?
That's such an important concern, and honestly, a valid one for any self-directed practice technique. My recommendation here is twofold. First, as we mentioned, use an AI tool occasionally to check your forward story for grammar accuracy, especially in the first couple of weeks, while you're still building confidence with structures like past perfect. Second, don't be afraid of imperfection during the actual practice session itself. Remember, the primary goal of the backward construction phase is cognitive friction and retrieval effort, not perfect accuracy on the very first attempt. It's completely fine, even expected, to make mistakes while you're building the chain. The goal is that over time, with occasional feedback and continued practice, your accuracy naturally improves because you're engaging so much more deeply with these structures than you would through passive study alone.
That's reassuring because I think a lot of learners get paralyzed by the fear of practicing something incorrectly and somehow locking in a bad habit.
Right, and honestly, that fear, while understandable, often does more harm than good because it leads learners back toward passive, low-friction study methods purely to avoid the discomfort of making mistakes. But mistakes made during active, effortful production are a completely normal, healthy part of the learning process, especially when you're periodically checking your output and correcting course along the way.
Third question, can this technique be done with a partner, or is it strictly a solo practice method?
Great question. And honestly, it works beautifully both ways. Solo practice, talking to yourself, recording yourself is completely valid and effective, especially for daily consistency. But if you have a study partner or even a patient friend or family member willing to help, you can make this even more powerful by having them ask you the why questions out loud rather than asking yourself internally. There's something about having another person genuinely waiting for your answer that adds a slightly higher level of real conversational pressure, which can be a great way to level up your practice once you're comfortable with the solo version.
That's a great point, and it also makes me think this could be a fantastic activity for English conversation clubs or language exchange partners.
Absolutely. I think it would work wonderfully in that context. One person offers a climax sentence, the other person has to build the entire reverse chain out loud in real time, while their partner keeps asking why at each step. It adds a social, slightly playful element to what is otherwise a fairly solitary cognitive exercise.
One more question, and I think this is a big one. How long before someone can realistically expect to notice a difference in their actual spontaneous conversations outside of this specific practice exercise?
This is probably the question I get asked most often, honestly, and I want to be careful to give a realistic, honest answer rather than an overly dramatic promise. Based on what I've personally observed, and based on the underlying cognitive science we discussed earlier around retrieval practice and deep processing, most consistent learners, meaning those doing this daily for even just 10 to 15 minutes, start noticing a difference within roughly 2 to 3 weeks. It's usually not a sudden, dramatic transformation. It's more that certain structures, particularly past perfect and common resultative phrasal verbs, start coming out more automatically in completely unrelated conversations without the same hesitation or mental translation delay they used to experience.
That timeline feels very believable and honestly quite motivating because 2 to 3 weeks is a genuinely achievable short-term commitment for most people to test this out for themselves.
Exactly. And that's really why we built this into a 30-day framework. Specifically, it's long enough to build genuine, durable neural pathways, but short enough to feel achievable and motivating, rather than an overwhelming, endless commitment.
I actually want to add one more piece before we wrap up completely, because I know some of you watching have probably tried other fluency methods before, shadowing, flashcards, language exchange apps, immersion, and you might be wondering how reverse storytelling compares, or whether it should replace those methods entirely.
That's such a fair thing to address, and I want to be really clear here. I'm not saying every other method is useless. Some of them are genuinely valuable, just for different purposes. But I do think it's worth walking through a few of the most popular methods and explaining exactly where reverse storytelling fills a gap that those methods leave open.
Let's start with shadowing, since that's probably one of the most recommended techniques in the language learning community right now.
Yes, shadowing is where you listen to native audio and repeat it simultaneously, or almost simultaneously, trying to match the speaker's pronunciation, rhythm, and intonation as closely as possible. And honestly, shadowing is fantastic for pronunciation and listening skills. It genuinely helps train your ear and your mouth to produce native-like sounds and rhythm patterns.
But
But shadowing is still fundamentally a repetition-based method. You're not generating any original content. You're matching someone else's exact words, exact sentence, exact grammar choices. That means shadowing does very little to build your independent, spontaneous sentence construction ability, the actual skill you need when someone asks you an unpredictable question in real conversation, and there's no script to shadow.
So shadowing and reverse storytelling aren't really competing methods. They're training different skills entirely.
Exactly. And honestly, I'd recommend using both, just for different purposes. Shadowing for pronunciation and rhythm training using native audio, and reverse storytelling for building spontaneous, generative grammar and vocabulary retrieval. They complement each other beautifully rather than competing.
What about flashcards, spaced repetition apps, things like that? Those are incredibly popular for vocabulary building.
Flashcards and spaced repetition systems are excellent for one very specific thing, moving vocabulary from never seen it before into recognized passive memory. They're genuinely one of the most efficient tools that exist for that particular job, and the underlying spaced repetition algorithm is backed by really solid cognitive science.
But again, there's a but coming, I assume.
There is, and it's the same core issue we've been discussing this whole video. Flashcards test recognition, not production. When a flashcard shows you a word or phrase and you try to recall its meaning, you're doing retrieval, which is good. But it's retrieval of meaning, not retrieval of usage within a spontaneous, grammatically correct sentence in a real communicative context. Reverse storytelling picks up exactly where flashcards leave off. It takes vocabulary and grammar you already passively recognize and forces you to actively deploy it correctly in a real sentence under communicative pressure.
So again, complementary rather than competing. Flashcards build the raw vocabulary pool, and reverse storytelling trains you to actually pull from that pool fluently.
Exactly right. And let's touch on one more. Full immersion, meaning moving to an English-speaking country or surrounding yourself entirely with English media and conversation. Immersion is often held up as the gold standard, and there's truth to that. Immersion does provide an enormous amount of natural input and genuine communicative pressure.
But immersion isn't accessible to everyone, and even when it is, it doesn't guarantee fluency on its own.
Exactly. That's precisely the issue. Plenty of people live in English-speaking countries for years and still struggle with speaking fluently, precisely because daily life doesn't always force deep, effortful language production. You can live in an English-speaking city, mostly listening, occasionally producing very short, simple responses, and never actually build the deeper retrieval pathways we've been discussing this whole video. Immersion provides opportunity, but it doesn't automatically provide the specific kind of structured, effortful practice that actually builds spontaneous fluency. Reverse storytelling can be done anywhere, by anyone, regardless of whether they have access to full immersion, and it deliberately, systematically creates that effortful production practice that immersion only provides by chance.
I think that's such an important point for people who might feel discouraged because they don't have the opportunity to travel or live abroad. This technique genuinely puts a powerful fluency building tool within reach of literally anyone, anywhere, with just a phone or even just their own voice.
Exactly. And that's honestly part of why I'm so passionate about teaching this specific technique. It democratizes something that used to feel like it required expensive immersion trips, private tutors, or years of living abroad. With just 10 to 15 minutes a day and a willingness to push through a little bit of productive discomfort, anyone can start building genuine, spontaneous fluency starting today.
I think that's a beautiful note to start wrapping up on, actually. Should we move into our final summary?
Yes, let's bring everything together now.
Before we move into our final wrap-up, I actually think it would be incredibly valuable to give everyone a small vault of extra worked examples, enough that you could genuinely start your 30-day framework tomorrow without having to invent every single climax sentence yourself.
I love that idea because I know one of the biggest barriers to starting any new habit is simply not knowing what to do on day one. So let's move through several more examples fairly quickly, covering a range of topics and difficulty levels, so everyone has a real bank of practice material to draw from.
Let's start with a workplace scenario, since that's such a common context adult learners need English for. Climax. And that's how I ended up leading the entire meeting by myself.
Great one. Layer 1. Why did I end up leading it alone? I ended up leading the meeting alone because my manager had gotten stuck in another call that ran longer than expected. Layer 2. Why had the other call run longer than expected? It had run longer than expected because the client had raised several unexpected concerns that needed to be addressed on the spot. Layer 3. Why had the client raised those concerns? The client had raised those concerns because they had just received an internal report showing lower results than they had originally anticipated.
And the forward version, flipping all of that together?
The client had just received an internal report showing lower results than expected, so they raised several unexpected concerns during their call with my manager. Because that call ran much longer than planned, my manager got stuck and couldn't make it to our meeting on time, and that's how I ended up leading the entire meeting by myself.
That's such a useful one for anyone using English in a professional setting. Let's try a travel scenario next. Climax, and that's how I ended up sleeping in the airport overnight.
Layer 1. Why did I sleep in the airport? I ended up sleeping there because my connecting flight had been canceled due to a storm. Layer 2. Why hadn't I booked a hotel for the night instead? I hadn't booked a hotel because every single room nearby had already been fully booked by other stranded passengers. Layer 3. Why were so many passengers stranded? So many passengers were stranded because the storm had actually grounded flights across the entire region, not just mine.
Forward version?
A storm had grounded flights across the whole region, which meant hundreds of passengers were suddenly stranded, just like me. Because of that, every hotel room nearby had already been booked by the time I tried to find one. So, since my connecting flight had also been canceled, I ended up sleeping in the airport overnight. A very relatable travel story, and notice how many advanced structures came out naturally. Had been grounded, had already been booked, passive voice combined with past perfect, which is honestly a fairly advanced combination for most learners.
Let's try a relationship-based one now, something a bit more emotionally layered. Climax. And that's how I ended up trusting him again.
Layer 1. Why did I end up trusting him again? I ended up trusting him again because he had shown, through his actions over several months, that he had genuinely changed. Layer 2. Why did his actions matter more than his words? His actions mattered more because he had made promises before that he hadn't kept, so I had learned not to believe words alone anymore. Layer 3. Why had he not kept his promises before? He hadn't kept them before because, back then, he had been dealing with problems of his own that he hadn't been honest with me about.
That's a beautifully nuanced example, genuinely. Forward version?
Back then, he had been dealing with problems of his own that he hadn't been honest with me about, which meant he made promises he couldn't keep. Because of that, I had learned not to believe words alone anymore. But over several months, his actions showed me that he had genuinely changed, and that's how I ended up trusting him again. Look at the emotional maturity and grammatical sophistication packed into that short story, multiple layers of past perfect, a natural causal connector chain, and genuinely moving human content.
Let's do a lighter, funnier one now, just to balance things out. Climax. And that's how I accidentally called my boss Mom during a meeting.
Oh, this is a fun one. Layer 1. Why did I accidentally say that? I accidentally said that because I had just gotten off the phone with my actual mom right before the meeting started. Layer 2. Why was that call still on my mind? The call was still on my mind because my mom had told me some surprising news right before I had to rush into the meeting. Layer 3. Why hadn't I taken a moment to clear my head first? I hadn't taken a moment because the meeting had already started 5 minutes late, and I didn't want to make it worse by walking in even later.
Forward version, please. I need to hear how this one resolves.
The meeting had already started 5 minutes late, so I didn't want to delay it any further by taking extra time to clear my head. But my mom had just told me some surprising news right before I rushed in, and it was still completely on my mind. So without even thinking, I accidentally called my boss Mom during the meeting. A funny, embarrassing, completely relatable story, and again, built entirely from natural causal reasoning.
I think these examples really show the range of this technique: professional, dramatic, emotional, and even funny, embarrassing moments. Let's give the audience a few more climax prompts they can use on their own, without us building the full example, just to round out this practice vault.
Great idea! Let's give 6 more prompts at increasing difficulty that everyone watching can pause and try themselves. Prompt 1, beginner level. And that's how I broke my favorite mug. Prompt 2, beginner level. And that's how I ended up eating dinner alone. Prompt 3, intermediate level. And that's how I finally finished the book I'd been avoiding for months. Prompt 4, intermediate level. And that's how I ended up becoming friends with my roommate. Prompt 5, advanced level. And that's why I decided to stop checking my phone first thing in the morning. Prompt 6, advanced level. And that's how I realized I had been wrong about someone for years.
Those are fantastic, genuinely usable prompts, covering a huge range of emotional depth and grammatical complexity. I'd encourage everyone watching to screenshot this part of the video or write these down somewhere so you have them ready for your very first week of practice.
Exactly. And remember, don't feel like you need to use them in this exact order, or even use all of them. Pick whichever one genuinely sparks something for you, because that personal connection, even to a semi-invented story, really does make a difference in how deeply the practice sticks.
One thing I want to add here, actually, is a reminder about the mini exercise format we've been using throughout this whole video. Every single time we've paused to give you a climax sentence, that's a genuine invitation to stop, try it yourself, and only then keep watching or listening to our version. The learning doesn't happen from hearing Lily and I do it, it happens from you doing it yourself.
That's such an important reminder, Bruce. Thank you for adding that. Passive listening to our examples, even really good examples, still falls into that same low-friction trap we described at the very beginning of this video. The real transformation happens when you personally generate your own reverse chain, using your own reasoning, your own vocabulary choices, your own voice.
Absolutely. All right. I think we've given everyone an incredibly thorough toolkit today. The theory, the mechanics, the deeper linguistic reasoning, the rhythm and delivery techniques, the full 30-day framework, a comparison to other popular methods, and now this practice vault of extra examples and prompts.
It really has been a comprehensive lesson, and I'm honestly really proud of how much ground we've covered together today.
I want to address something honestly, because I think it's important we don't pretend this technique is always easy from day one. What should someone do if they genuinely feel stuck? If they ask themselves, why, and nothing comes to mind at all?
That's such an important thing to talk about, because it does happen, especially in the first few days. And I want to normalize that completely. Feeling stuck is not a sign that the technique isn't working for you. In many ways, it's a sign that you found the exact edge of your current ability, which is precisely where growth happens.
So, what's the actual practical advice, though?
If someone is sitting there genuinely blank, what should they do in that moment?
My first piece of advice is to lower the pressure slightly without abandoning the exercise entirely. If a fully formed past perfect sentence doesn't come to you immediately, allow yourself a simpler starting point. Say the reason in your first language internally for just a second, purely to unblock your thinking, and then immediately try to rebuild it in English. This isn't ideal long-term, and I wouldn't want anyone doing this every single time, but as an occasional unblocking tool in your first week, it's completely fine.
That's reassuring because I think some learners might feel like using their first language at all, even briefly, means they're doing the technique wrong.
Not at all. And honestly, this connects to something we haven't explicitly discussed yet, the difference between productive struggle and unproductive frustration. Productive struggle is that useful cognitive friction we've been talking about this entire video, effortful but ultimately solvable, given a bit of time and mental push. Unproductive frustration is when you're so completely blocked that you're not learning anymore, you're simply stressed. If you notice yourself sliding from struggle into frustration, that's the signal to simplify slightly. Maybe drop from 4 layers to 2. Maybe allow that brief internal translation as a stepping stone. Maybe choose an easier, more concrete climax sentence instead of an abstract one.
That's a really healthy, balanced approach because I think a lot of learners either push through frustration in an unhealthy way or give up entirely the moment something feels difficult, and neither extreme actually serves them well.
Exactly. And this is really a skill in itself. Learning to recognize the difference between this is hard, but I can push through it, and I am completely stuck, and pushing further right now isn't productive. Over time, as you get more comfortable with the technique, that second category becomes rarer and rarer. But especially in week 1, it's completely normal to hit it occasionally.
What about learners who feel self-conscious speaking out loud, even when they're completely alone? I know this sounds like a small thing, but I genuinely think it stops a lot of people from doing spoken practice at all.
That's actually not a small thing at all, Bruce. I think it's a huge, often unspoken barrier for a lot of learners. My honest advice here is to start even smaller than you think you need to. If speaking out loud feels too exposing, even alone in your room, start by whispering your reverse story instead. Whispering still engages your speech muscles and your real-time sentence construction process, but it removes some of that self-conscious pressure. Over the first several days, gradually increase your volume as you build comfort. By the end of week 1, most learners find they've naturally transitioned to a normal speaking volume without even consciously deciding to.
That's such a practical, gentle way to ease into it, rather than forcing full volume from day 1, which honestly could feel intimidating enough to make someone quit before they even really start.
Exactly. And I'd rather someone whisper their reverse stories consistently for 30 days than attempt full, confident, out loud speaking for 2 days and then quit because it felt too uncomfortable too soon.
What about learners who complete the 30-day framework and want to know what comes next? Is there a level 2 version of this technique?
I love this question because it shows real commitment, thinking ahead to what comes after the initial 30 days. Yes, absolutely. There's a natural progression here. Once you've completed the full framework, I'd recommend a few specific ways to keep leveling up. First, increase your layer depth even further. Push to 6, 7, even 8 layers on your more ambitious days, which will start pulling in even more nuanced structures, like mixed conditionals or more sophisticated hedging language, such as "it's likely that" or "it seems as though."
What's a second way to level up?
Second, start doing this technique with topics from your actual professional or academic field in English rather than only personal, everyday stories. If you work in finance, build reverse chains explaining business outcomes. If you're a student, build reverse chains explaining academic arguments or research conclusions. This transfers the exact same cognitive mechanism into the specific vocabulary and context you'll actually need English for in your real life.
That's such a smart extension, because it means the technique doesn't just build general fluency, it can be specifically tailored to build fluency in whatever specialized context matters most to you personally.
Exactly. And third, and this is probably the most advanced extension, start doing this technique live in real conversation with a partner without any preparation at all. At this stage, you're not sitting down deliberately to practice. Instead, whenever a natural conversation moment arises where someone asks you, "Why did that happen?" or "Why do you think that?" you consciously apply the same backward reasoning instinct we've built through weeks of deliberate practice, but now live in the moment in a real, unscripted conversation.
That's really the ultimate goal, isn't it? For this to stop being a separate exercise entirely and just become the way your brain naturally processes and explains things in English all the time.
Exactly. That's the true end goal of this entire technique. The structured, deliberate practice sessions are simply the training ground. The real destination is for this kind of clear, causal, grammatically rich reasoning to become your natural, default way of explaining anything in English, without needing to consciously think about the steps anymore.
I think that's such a powerful way to frame the entire journey. 30 days of deliberate, sometimes uncomfortable practice in service of a much bigger, longer-term shift in how your brain naturally handles English.
Exactly. And that shift, once it happens, tends to stay with learners permanently, precisely because it's built on genuine, deep cognitive pathways, not memorized scripts or temporary tricks. Okay, let's bring everything together. We've covered a lot today, so I want to walk through the key takeaways one more time, because repetition of ideas, unlike repetition of memorized phrases, is actually a great way to cement understanding.
Let's do it. Where should we start?
Let's start with the core problem we opened this video with, the fluency paradox. So many learners can understand English at a high level, but freeze up and may try to speak it themselves. And we explained why that happens. Comprehension and production are different skills, using overlapping but distinct cognitive pathways. Passive methods like listening and simple repetition train comprehension and short-term echo, but they don't train the deep, effortful retrieval process required for genuine, spontaneous speech.
And the missing ingredient, as you explained, is cognitive friction, the mental effort involved in actively generating language yourself, rather than passively receiving or repeating it.
Exactly, and that's where the reverse storytelling technique comes in. Instead of telling a story from beginning to end, which is naturally low friction and predictable, we start at the climax and work backward, asking why at every single step, forcing ourselves to build complete, grammatically correct sentences that explain the previous statement.
We walked through the actual mechanics in detail, starting with a climax sentence, asking why, building a full causal sentence in response, often naturally pulling in past perfect tense, because we're explaining something that happened even earlier in the past. We build multiple layers this way, going as deep as feels appropriate for our level, and then we flip the entire chain forward, delivering it as one smooth, natural story.
And we went deep into exactly why this triggers such advanced linguistic structures: past perfect, conditional moods, resultative phrasal verbs, not because we're consciously trying to insert them, but because the logical structure of explaining causes and justifying outcomes naturally requires these tools. Grammar stops being an abstract rule you memorize and becomes a tool you reach for instinctively because it's the only thing that correctly solves the communication problem in front of you.
We also talked about the neuroscience behind why this works so much better than simple repetition. The difference between shallow processing, which is what happens when you just repeat something, and deep processing, which happens when you actively reconstruct something yourself, engaging multiple cognitive systems at once and building far stronger, more durable memories through elaborative encoding.
Then we moved into natural speech rhythm, and this is something I really want to emphasize again because it's such a hidden, often overlooked benefit. Because reverse storytelling is built around a repeated question and answer structure, it naturally highlights which part of each sentence carries the most important new information. And that's exactly the part of the sentence that should be stressed when you speak. This teaches natural sentence stress automatically without any separate pronunciation drilling.
We also talked about layering in natural fluency markers, words like well, I mean, so basically, but only after the backward construction phase is complete, so your brain isn't trying to juggle grammar construction and natural delivery at the exact same time.
And finally, we laid out that full 30-day framework, starting with simple 2 to 3 layer stories in week 1, adding more connective variety and emotional depth in week 2, introducing AI-generated unpredictable climax prompts in week 3, and shifting toward rapid, natural forward delivery and more abstract, opinion-based topics in week 4.
We even compared this technique to other popular methods, shadowing, flashcards, full immersion, and showed how reverse storytelling fills a very specific gap that those other methods leave open, specifically around spontaneous, generative sentence construction under real communicative pressure.
So here's what I want to leave you with, genuinely. If you've watched this entire video, you now understand something about language acquisition that most learners never fully grasp. That fluency isn't primarily about how much vocabulary you know or how many hours of content you've consumed. It's about whether you can access what you already know quickly, flexibly, and correctly under real conversational pressure. And the fastest, most reliable way to build that access is through structured, effortful, self-generated language production, exactly what the reverse storytelling technique is designed to create every single time you practice it.
I think what strikes me most about this whole conversation is how much this reframes what practice even means for language learners. It's not about consuming more content passively. It's about deliberately putting yourself in situations where your brain has no choice but to build something new from scratch, using the tools it already has.
Exactly. And that reframe alone, even before you do a single reverse story, is genuinely valuable because it changes how you'll approach every future study session. Instead of asking, what more can I watch or read today, start asking, what can I make myself produce today that I haven't produced before?
That's such a powerful shift in mindset. Now, before we completely close this out, I do want to remind everyone one more time. If you found real value in this lesson, please take a moment to like this video, share it with a friend who's also learning English, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We put a genuine amount of thought and care into breaking down techniques like this one, and your support genuinely helps us keep making this kind of deep, practical content.
It really does. Thank you so much for that, Bruce. And one more time, if you're hungry for even more English listening and speaking practice beyond what we cover today, make sure to check out our podcast playlist right here on this channel. You'll find a whole collection of lessons designed specifically to help you improve your English naturally through real, natural conversation, exactly like the one Bruce and I just had with you.
So here's your final challenge, and I want you to actually do this, not just think about doing it. As soon as this video ends, or honestly, even right now if you're able to pause, choose one climax sentence. It can be something that really happened to you today, or something completely invented. Ask why at least twice. Build full, complete sentences at each layer using past perfect if the logic calls for it, then flip the whole thing forward and say it out loud from start to finish in one smooth breath.
And notice how it feels. Notice that moment of friction when you're not sure what the next why answer should be. And then notice the small, genuine satisfaction when you figure it out yourself, in English, without translating from your first language first. That feeling right there is exactly what real fluency building feels like. It's not always comfortable, but it is absolutely, genuinely effective.
Do this every day for the next 30 days, following the framework we laid out today, and I promise you, the difference in how quickly complex English comes to you in real conversations will be something you can actually feel, not just something you hope is happening.
We believe in you, genuinely. Every single person watching this video has the ability to build real, natural fluency. It's simply a matter of practicing in a way that actually builds the skill you need, instead of a skill that only feels productive.
Thank you so much for watching this entire lesson with us today.
Thank you for being here and for investing this time in your own growth. That says a lot about you as a learner.
We'll see you in the next video.
Take care, keep practicing, and we'll talk to you very soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.